GitHub Actions are a powerful tool to automate your workflow. You can also use them to run tests, deploy your code, and much more. The cool thing is, GitHub Actions can also be found in a public marketplace, which means action made by you, by the community. But what if you cannot find the action you need? Well, you can create your own and publish to the marketplace for everyone else. This will be a really long tutorial. I will add chapters down below so that you can skip to your interested part, but today we will talk about how to create a GitHub action in Typescript, how to expand our action to support custom inputs, how to integrate with GitHub's API to add labels to pull requests, and actually you can do much more after you learn how to use the API. We will see, I lost the count. Well, we will see how to unit test your application, how to debug your application in Visual Studio Code. We will also see together how you can publish your action to the GitHub Marketplace, how to use your action in a different repository right after publishing it to the marketplace, and some final touches to make your application more robust. Like I said, this will be much longer than usual, and you can actually see that from the bar down below, but I will also recommend you to follow along this tutorial and create your own action while watching this video, so that you can learn much more, and at the end of the video you will have your own action fully working so that you can customize it to make it do whatever you want to do. And these were all the communication I had. We can now jump straight into the tutorial. Let's begin with our minimal viable product. The only file you really need is action.yaml. This will basically be the full content at the end of this tutorial, but for now we can get rid of branding, which is for publishing the action. We can get rid of the inputs, we're gonna use them later. And also you could even remove the author, and this is a perfectly acceptable action.yaml. Let me add the author back, because why not? And let's move to the next step. We now want to create an empty node project, as we define we will run on node for our Typescript. So npm init, and yes! This will basically create a package.json, and that's our starting point. Let's begin by adding a build script here, which will use tsc, as in fact we're gonna run this in Typescript. But do we have Typescript installed? Well, sure. npm install -d for dev dependencies and Typescript. We now want to set up Typescript properly, so we need to run this command npx tsc and init. Once again, this will generate a ts config, and here we have a lot of stuff, but we can replace to this one I already prepared, which will have all we need for this simple application. Next up, we want to create our actual application, so we need a source folder and an index.ts file. Here we can write the full code of our action, for example, console log hello, or maybe hello world. That's an MVP, right? So let's keep it simple for now, and we'll get later on with more complicated stuff. Now we have our index, we have our package.json, our ts config. We can now run npm run build, so that our application is actually transpiled in JavaScript, and you can find here in lib our index.ts, this here. Let's run again the build, and now the transpiled JavaScript will be in the dist folder. We can get rid of this one for now. Before moving on, maybe we want to create a Git repository. So there you have it. Git init will generate the Git folder, and this is our repository. But we see all of these files are green, and also node modules. Well, that's because we need git ignore. So npx git ignore and node. This will download the git ignore specifically for node projects. But this will also remove dist from the repository, which is usually fine, but not in this specific use case. So we can go back on our git ignore, look for dist, and remove it for now. It's finally time to git add everything and git commit. And we're all set. Let's go on part number 2, that is running our action. First of all, if you want to run an action, you need a .github folder with inside a workflows folder with inside all your workflows. For example, hello.yaml. here we can actually define how our action will be run. We will need a name. We also need when the action will be executed. For now, we will use workflow dispatch, which means the action runs only when manually called. By the way, I created an entire video on that. And what will our action do? We have a job called hello. It runs on Ubuntu latest. It will check out our repository and will basically run the action defined at the root folder. We don't need this for now. And how can it find the action? Well, at the root folder we have action.yaml, which says that the action will basically run this index.js with node 16. That is exactly our action. If you want to test it now, we have to push it to GitHub. So let's git add everything, git commit hello action. We can now git push, and we cannot git push because there's no repository. So we can publish to GitHub, gh label issue public repository, and we can now push. Or actually we can open it on GitHub and we can see that it's already there. Now we can go on actions, we will find our hello action, and since it has workflow dispatch, we can press this button and run the workflow. Right after refreshing the page, you will see that the hello action is now running, and in a couple of seconds, starting setup, and there you have it, hello world, and congratulations, you just created your very first GitHub action. By the way, if you don't want to commit and push every time and you have act installed, just type act to spawn a Docker container which will run the action. As you can see, hello world is here. And I obviously made an entire video on that too. All the links are in the description and in my YouTube channel. It's now time to finally add some inputs. The first thing we have to do is go back to action.yaml and actually define them here. We can create the inputs object. We can say the name in our hello action. Description will be the name to say hello to, require true, and default word. That's fine. Next up, if we want to pass some inputs to our action, we can also do that from here. We can use with name and add your name. Now that we have defined the name and specified which name we have to add, let's go back to our action and add it so that it can read the name. In order to interact with the action, you need to install the package action/core. This is an official package from GitHub, which will give you, for example, a function called getInput. We will see that in a second. Now that the package is installed, you can say const name equals to getInput, and it will read the name parameter. Now getInput is not imported, and we can get it from action/core, that is the package we just installed. We can add the name here, and there you have it. That's all you have to do. But I'm not gonna run the action yet, because I want to go to the next step before finding that something is still missing here. So we learned the basics, we saw how to use an input, and now let's go to the next level, that is actually interacting with GitHub in order to add a label to our pull request. The first thing we have to do is to install a new package, that is action/GitHub. Again, it's an official package from GitHub, which will let us interact with the GitHub API. I'm not gonna spend some time writing the full code live, but this is pretty much the final result. We now created a function called run, where we read the inputs. We can now create an AutoKit client. This is from the library we just installed. We can check if there's a pull request. And with this simple call to the official REST API from GitHub, we can basically add a label, which will be the label we read from the input. In case something goes wrong, we can call setFailed, again imported from action core, which will set the action as failed. Last but not least, the run function is invoked here in the last line. Now, we notice that we have our action.yaml, which now has the name input we had from before. Well, let's replace it with the new inputs we have. So, we will need the GitHub token for authentication and the label we want to be displayed in the pull request. We can now go back to our defined workflow, replace this input with the new one we will need. In this case, we have this needs review label, super fine, easy is a string, and this syntax for interpolation and secrets.gh token. This is something that gets injected automatically by GitHub. I wish I could say I already have a video about that, but the video is coming soon. So you better subscribe so that you will know when the video about secrets and environment variables on GitHub Actions will be out, roughly in a couple of weeks by now. One extra thing we want to change here is that we will no longer run this action on workflow dispatch, but we'll run it when a pull request is opened or reopened. And we're all set. We can now run npm run build so that our index.js here gets updated with all the new code we just wrote, and we can push to a repository to find if the action is working. So we add everything, we commit, and we push. If we go back to our repository, the quickest way to create a pull request is just creating a new file. We can just call it test, add test content here, and when we commit changes, we create a new branch and start a pull request. With this operation, we will immediately see if our action is actually working. After a second, you will see that this dot appeared, and actually if we refresh the page, some checks haven't completed yet. So our action is now running on the pull request open, and it failed. Let me see what happened here. We click detail, and we see that in the run section of our action, it will say cannot find module action core. But why it cannot? I mean, we added it here, we imported, and Visual Studio Code isn't saying anything bad about that. But if we actually look more closely to our index.js, this is the transpiled version of our code. But there's no trace about where those two are. So a trick we can use here is with the Vercel package at vercel/ncc. This package will basically bundle everything inside index.js, including the dependencies that we need. We now have to go back on our package.json and update our build command, including the fact that we need to run our ncc build, and we want it to output on lib/index.js. We will also need to make sure that now the outdir of this is again on lib, because this folder will be actually populated by ncc. Now, if we run npm run build again, you will see that first the lib folder is created with our code, and after this will actually contain all the code that we need to run our application and everything that happens underneath. Since we don't want this index to be pushed to the repository, we can go back to gitignore and actually add lib. We can now do another attempt, add everything to a Git repository, commit and say that action is fixed, and push our action. Next up, we can go back to our pull request. Since we say that the action will run if the pull request is opened or reopened, the super quick way to test it is to close the pull request and to reopen it again. What will happen now is that the action will be run again as we reopen the pull request. And will it work now? Well, let's see. It's now running the checkout, and it failed again. Why did it fail? Parameter token or opt.out is required. This wouldn't happen for an action that just prints hello world, but since this action is using a GitHub token to perform an action on the repository, it will need a little bit extra permissions to do this action. So we can go on settings from our repository, we can go to action, general, scroll down, and here you will see the workflow permissions. Our workflow will also need the right permission in order to run properly. We now have saved, so well, we can go back to our pull request, again do the same trick. So we close the pull request, we reopen the pull request, refresh the page, we see the action is gonna start in a moment, we look at the details, and it failed again. Why though? Sorry, just realized that I always use GH token here, but the actual name is GitHub token. So let's fix it and push again the changes, and let me run again the action in our pull request. And now, this time, if we refresh the page, we will see the action, hopefully adding the label to our pull request. It is running, and there you have it. So, what happened? Our pull request actually interacted with the GitHub REST APIs and added the needs review label as soon as the pull request is opened or reopened in case the label is not there. Fun fact, the label wasn't actually listed here, but GitHub is smart enough that if you add a label from the API, it will also create if it doesn't exist. By the way, this whole GH token incident is basically what happens if you let GitHub Copilot write the code for you. Most of the time it is right, but this time it auto-suggested me GH token and I didn't double check if the name was correct, and I wasted like 25 minutes finding out why the permission was not set. And the answer, because I accepted a code that I didn't know. So be careful when using Copilot. We now have our GitHub action, but you will never push something in production without making sure it is properly tested, right? Well, let's install Jest. We'll also need ts-jest and types-jest because we're in Typescript. Now that we have the dependencies, let me also add a new file that is jest.config.json. This will basically tell Jest a little bit more on how do we want to use it. And first of all, we need to specify that the preset is ts-jest. That is one of the libraries we just installed. The reason is simple, we're in Typescript. We can now create a new file inside our source, maybe inside the folder tests, call index.test.ts. Since I'm lazy and already waste a lot of time with Copilot, I will let Copilot Chat generate the tests for me. And this is the output. So it will just try to mock the APIs, mock the inputs, and it will create some use cases. Again, since the scope of the video is not about writing the actual code, but about all the architecture and step, let me just paste the test I just did. All you need to know is that basically I will mock Actions, GitHub, and Actions core, so that, for example, I can make sure that it throws an error if it's not run on pull request, add labels to the pull request, and handle the error when set failed is called. Nothing too complicated. The issue here is that I also need to export this function so that it can run in tests, and I can run tests. Or actually, I need to modify package.json first because this is still the default message. I can go on package.json here, and finally, I can replace test with jest. If I run the test again, you will see that jest will run my tests and hopefully it will go green. So we tested our code and 3 out of 3 tests are passed. Now, if we type build again here in the console, you will see that the tests are also included in our build, which is something we do not want. What can we do here? Well, in our ts-config, we can add an extra option called exclude, which will basically exclude all the tests we created. If we run the build again, we will see that tests are no longer there. Or actually, since we do not remove it, we need to delete it first. And if we create the build again, you will see that the lib folder is generated without test inside of it. One more extra thing to take care about is that we have this run function here, which will run every time the action is actually imported. So in our test, it will run basically twice. The first time, because it's imported here, and then again every time we call await run here. How can we avoid that? Well, a simple solution is to basically wrap this run function and only call it if there's not set a jest worker ID. This way, if the action is run by jest, it will not auto-run everything here, but only when the method run is actually called. We can finally do our commit, and action is tested. That's great, we're ready to move into the next chapter. In case you want to debug the action and run step by step, you can do that super easily with Visual Studio Code. I know you can have console logs, but you better use Debugger as well. In this specific case, there will not too much to debug because we will probably already fail here. But for example, if I set a breakpoint, I can already show you how it actually works. Now on Visual Studio Code, all you have to do is create a new file that will be inside the .ps code folder called launch.json. This will be the launch configuration for our debugger. We can just paste this one already prepared and make sure to call ts node register here, or just copy paste this code. Oh, by the way, this is obviously everything hosted on GitHub, so you can find down below the link to the repository in case you want to look and copy paste something. So now that we have the configuration set, if we go back here and we press F5, it cannot find module ts node register because we have to install it. So let's get back to the terminal and install in the dev dependencies the package ts node. We can now press F5 again and let's see what happens. We're there. You can see here we have a debugger stopping this position, and if we move further we will get an error because it tried to get the token. So we have two inputs, right? How can we pass the inputs from here? Well, from our launch.json, we can consider them as an environment variables. In this case, all we have to do is add an env object here with our variables. Make sure to always prefix them with input and an underscore, and to write them all uppercase. In this case, we can see uppercase in this case, whatever. Now, now we have this GH token, which obviously is not the actual token, but it's more than enough to see that if we press F5, you will find here that label is indeed needs review and token is indeed the token we just set. This is more than enough to make sure that our get input here actually read our environment variables. As you can see, we actually read our inputs, and this is something you might need in case you have to test your application or actually debug your application without using console logs. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. We can finally publish our action. If you properly set up an action.yaml file here, you will already see in the repository this publish to Action Marketplace banner with a draft or release button. Just click it. First of all, it will give you a warning which you can improve your action by adding labels for icon and color, which basically is what we said the first time we saw this action.yaml. That is, you can add a branding here with an icon and a color. So let's do it real quick. Git CMA, add branding, and git push. By the way, git CMA is an alias. Guess what? I made a video about git aliases. You might want to have a look at my channel. Let's get back on our publish page. Let's refresh, and everything looks good. I now added our icon and our color. But in case you want to publish the action to the marketplace, you also need a README file, which actually makes sense. And let's create one real quick. We will update it maybe later. We can commit the changes, commit directly to the main branch. If we go back here, again on draft or release, now we're for real all set. We have our action, we have a README file, the sun is going down, and we can now select a primary category. For example, this might be, let's say, open source management. I haven't read them all, but maybe there's one more appropriate. You can choose a secondary category, and now it's time to release your application. You can either choose an existing tag or create a new one on publish. For example, it could be version 1.0.0. This will create a new tag as soon as I hit the release. We can now add our release title, and we might want to use a description. And this is basically all you have to do to publish your action, which is just compiling a simple form and publish release. It will actually ask you to confirm the code with GitHub Mobile in case you have it set. I think it's mandatory, but let me see. So the number is 93. Now that I have approved with my mobile, that's it. First release, and you see this marketplace badge here. It's actually a button, and if you click it, you will jump on the marketplace. Congratulations! Your first GitHub action, your custom GitHub action you created, is now live on the marketplace, and everyone in the world, well, everyone using GitHub Action can now use it in their own repository, which, by the way, will be the next step of this video. If you now want to use this action on another repository, or if someone else wants to use this action, you can see this huge button, Use Latest Version, which basically will just tell you to copy-paste this code. And the important thing is that the action name will be your account name and the action name right after. You can click here to copy, and you can paste it in your workflow. Here you can also choose a previous version, and you can also specify the branch name. For example, this is another repository I have, was actually for, guess what, another video on GitHub Actions. And here I created my own workflow where inside of it I say uses /gh label issue at main. This means if you want to use the latest stable version, you might want to add the version here, or if you trust the developer, it's me, you should, you can directly go with the branch name, so that every time the branch gets updated, your action will already run on the latest version. And now the final touches before actually going live with your project. If you notice, every time you do some change, in order to actually update the action, you also need to run the build command. That's because you need to update the content of dist, which does not go by itself. So, in case your project is used by many other people's, or in case you might forgot, you need something that makes it automatic that every time you do a commit, the action is actually rebuilt. How can you do that? Well, the best tool to do that is indeed Husky. Let's install it and let me tell you how it works. You can get Husky simply with npx husky-init and npm install. This will actually make sure you have all the needed files for Husky, which you can find here in source control. You will find here a new prepare command, Husky got installed, and you have a pre-commit hook here as a test. In our case, we don't want to run the test, even though it also might be a good practice, but we want npm run build, so that every time someone does a commit, also a build is performed. And obviously the output of the build is included in that commit. Let's run an npm install to make sure everything is set up properly. And now, if we add a commit, add Husky, you will see that a build will now be performed right before our commit. Since we already set up Husky that helps us setting git hooks, we might also want to add something like prettier and ESLint and lint staged. What are those tools doing? Well, prettier will make sure the code is formatted, ESLint will warn you about something that doesn't seem quite right in your code, and lint stage will help you running these two commands only on the files you're going to commit that are on the stage area. In order to make them work properly, you will also need some extra plugins and dependencies. Again, you can find all the code in the repository link down below, so you don't need to copy them from the screen. You can just Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V. And you will also need some config files. First of all, you need a file called .eslint.rc, which will be the rules for ESLint, and you can paste this one here. Then you will do pretty much the same, but for prettier rc, and you can paste this content instead. Well, maybe not with single quote, I don't like it. And guess what? The same for lint staged rc. This file will actually tell that only JS and TS files inside the source folder will get first prettier right to format them, and then ESLint max warning 0 actually made the commit fail in case you have some warnings. We now need to add on Husky that every time we do a commit, we also want to add npx lint stage. You can do that with this command, which will basically go here and add lint stage right below run build. Or maybe you might want to add them before, so that it fails immediately. One more npm install to make sure that the hook is properly set up in your git hooks, which actually is the same as npm run prepare, which will run Husky install. And now you're all set. Finally, you can commit, and you will see here, right before a commit, it runs stage lint. In this case, it didn't file any files, but that's because it didn't change source. It did the build, because why not? And your repository is now good to go. If you follow all these steps until this point, you now have a pretty solid GitHub action published in the GitHub Actions Marketplace. You have tests running, you have lint, printer, so that's basically all the building blocks you need for a proper successful open source project. I hope you enjoyed this really long video. It's slightly different than what I usually do, but please let me know in the comment if you actually enjoyed this long tutorial, because, well, I might do more in the future. Thanks again for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe if you like my content, and don't forget that in the description you will find all the links you might need. So that was really everything for today. See you in the next video.